So in this tutorial we are going to see how to know the unique ID of every object in Ruby. So you have objects in any language and every object is stored somewhere in some memory, and you can say that why not just get the memory location of that object, and that will be kind of unique because at one location you will have only one object. But there is a problem with that approach because there are garbage collectors and there are so many things happening. So your language, your platform, your framework might be moving around those objects, so you cannot be even sure. Like if you go by the memory location of the object, then that will be uniquely identified. It might change, something might happen. But that is why in Ruby you have a way to get some unique identification number of any object. So when you ask for ID of any object in Ruby, it will return you an integer and it will be same for that object. I mean, as long as that object lives, it will have the same object ID. So now we will look at that. So if I say, okay, so A is an object. Now I want to know what is the ID of this object. A dot object underscore ID. So this is the method. This method can be called on any Ruby object and it will return some unique ID which will be same for that object as long as that object lives. Same way, if I have a string and I want to know the ID of this object, of this string object, then I will call object underscore ID and you will see here, this is the thing that you got. So I mean, Ruby has some mechanism of storing objects. Sometimes there are some objects which will have some specific place. So if your object is this, then you will get this object underscore ID of 20. If your object is nil, then the object underscore ID is 8. Now if you have A is equal to nil, now A is a variable which is pointing to this nil object. Okay, so what is the object ID of A? 8. So previously we saw that when A was equal to 1, then object ID of A was 3. Now when A is equal to nil, then object underscore ID of A is 8. Why is so? Why are we changing the ID of this object? So actually A is not the object here. A is just a reference to the object. So previously A was referencing to this object, integer 1. Now A is referencing to this object, nil object. So when I call A dot object underscore ID, it returns the ID of the object it is referencing to. So that is why you saw like A has different object underscore IDs, because now A is changing the objects it is referencing to, it is referring to. So nil object, you can see here, is always having the same object underscore ID, whether we directly call nil dot object underscore ID or A is equal to nil and then A dot object underscore ID. So nil will always have the same object ID. So now if I say B is equal to A, so B is a variable which is also referencing to the same object A is referencing to. So if I ask B dot object underscore ID, so again 8. So all these variables are referencing to the object nil. So that is why object underscore ID for all these variables is returning to the same. So our basic funda remains the same. Every object has the same object underscore ID as long as it lives. So in one particular scenario, your program has started running and you create any object, so that object will have same object underscore ID as long as it lives. Once it is gone, then it is gone. Okay, so that is the way we see how to get the ID of any object in Ruby. So that was all. Thank you. Have a good day.